My guest today is award-winning director and film editor Khary Saeed Jones. His newest film, the South by Southwest-selected NIGHT FIGHT. It is a work of aching introspection, memory, and the relentless weight of history. This haunting cinematic journey, part memoir, part meditation, and part reckoning, examines the violent interruptions that fracture Black life and the silent battles waged long after the danger has passed. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome film director and editor Khary Saeed Jones and his powerful film, NIGHT FIGHT, to the show. Welcome, Khary.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, your film, NIGHT FIGHT, was birthed from what happened to you about 7 years ago in rural Canada. What happened?
Well, my wife's Canadian, and her family is Canadian, and we have had a tradition of going for a weekend every summer to a kind of a summer, summer home, vacation home, and just spending some time together. The night before we were departing, early that morning, the night before we were going to depart. I went out to do my hour of writing, early in the morning at a Starbucks coffee shop, and filled up the tank of gas with the car with gas after leaving the coffee shop, and this guy was just clocking me, from the other lane as I was doing so, and from there it things really went south. He followed me, out of the gas station, and it kind of led to about some of the most intense 20 minutes of my life.
Now, why did he choose you out of everybody that may have been at the Starbucks or at the gas station? Why
Well,
you?
that's part of what the film is getting into, is just sort of like how you don't know. It just happens. And you grow up with stories passed down, in your family. You grow up with, being a kind of a student of history and human experience. Black experience. You know the history of Black folk in this country, and so almost regardless of what his real motivation was. I mean, I can't. I'm not a telepath. I can't. I didn't know what he was thinking. I just know what I felt, which was intense fear. And these experiences very much sort of they become what they are, and they mean what they mean to us, precisely because they feel anonymous. They are not experiences that make any sense. And yet you are kind of left to sort of make sense of it, and to talk about it or not to talk about it, to process it or not process it. But it's a kind of like this weight that you have to carry.
Your film brings something up, and your film is very complete, is what I like to call it. And everybody
Mm.
needs to see this film for many different reasons. Here it is, modern day. And you live through this experience in modern day.
Mm.
That introspection that you went through, it has to be shocking
Mm.
to think back that 200 years ago, things haven't changed
Yeah.
for Black life.
Mm.
Things have not changed, and here you are living this experience just 7 years ago. That is an experience that many others dealt with 200 years ago. It's
Yeah.
it's absolutely, even to me, it's absolutely shocking.
Yeah. I mean, look. I mean, I think that many things have changed for the better. But that vulnerability that Black folk, that many people of color feel, is something that it was, yeah, as you're saying, it was here yesterday, it's here today, and unfortunately, I think it's going to be here tomorrow. And we are left to as I was saying earlier, you're kind of left to sort of to hold that. And for me, the film was, in part, the process was a kind of an act of processing what I experienced, and almost like finding, a kind of community in the voices of the people who were I was fortunate enough to speak to in the film.
Was this area in which you were in, and a lot of people are not even going to understand the term of what I'm about to use, and you
Right.
most likely know the term. Um, they're called sundown towns.
Hmm.
When the sun goes down, if you're not white, you either need to leave or you need
Right.
to be indoors. Was that
Yeah.
that type of area?
Not no. This is a rural Canada. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad, coming out of the U.S. into Canada. It was one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad. So it is a place where where Black folk, even before, independent of the migration of Black folk out of the U.S. into Canada in the 19th century. Um, that had Black folk, where there was, actually the Wilson sisters, who are two of the women who I speak with in the film. Their family, the Sheffield family, has been in that part of Canada for into the mid 19th century. So, but it was, I would not say it's not at all a sundown town, but it's a place that has a racial history. And I think that what you find is that where Black people have lived, there is that friction, right? It's almost, sometimes it's in the places where we have not lived, where that kind of like that friction does not exist, where that the history does not exist. But when there have been efforts by Black folk to settle in places, they are not always welcomed with open arms.
I I understand by watching your film and others that I have talked to on this very subject, and I am open and honest to say that I have learned a lot. I was raised in East Texas, which back in the day would be considered a very racist part of the state.
Yeah.
So much better now. We're probably now considered probably the most diverse section of the
Well.
state now. But in the past, it wasn't always that way.
Hmm.
But I want to get into the elements of your film because there are
Sure.
so many important things to talk about. The film starts off with the mention of the talk. Now, to
Yeah.
Caucasians and whites, this means to discuss the birds and the bees, but to the Black family, the version of the talk has a whole new meaning. Can you explain?
Sure. It is a conversation that I dreaded. In that, I think that sometimes it's kind of like thrust on you, before you're really ready to sort of, to get into it. But it is that conversation that you have with your Black children, as that they're out in the world. They're no longer little kids. They are no longer sort of, going to be sort of assumed to be sort of, just, innocent, bystanders, and going about their business. But they are going to be potentially, seen as a threat, and they are going to be subject to the prejudices of at worst, I would say, members of law enforcement who may misunderstand or misrecognize, or because of inherent biases or real bias, or intentional bias, um, you know bring them into situations, of arrest or harassment that, are solely based on the color of their skin. And it is a talk that attempts to kind of communicate to them ways of managing their how they are perceived, frankly. And if they are so, unfortunate to be pulled over, to be, pulled aside, um, how you are to to manage your emotions, what you are to say, what you are not to say, how you are to move, how you are not to move. And it is a kind of frankly, kind of an indoctrination into um, the history of behavior that and emotion, that emotional the emotional life and the physical behavior that Black folk have inherited from their parents and grandparents and relatives for generations.
I recently saw this full length feature film. It was a 1940s piece. The two main characters, one white, one black. And there's a scene in the film in which the black actor, his dialogue was so shocking because it brings the reality of what you just said. And he
Hmm.
said, "What is it that for me to walk into a place and that every movement I make is judged? How humble do I have to make the look on my face so the other person doesn't feel threatened?"
Yeah,
And I was taken back by that. And to see truth brought forth in dialogue like that was extremely powerful.
yeah.
And you have some very powerful people in your film. One, historian Vincent Brown, who made a
Mm.
statement that an environment may or may not be uh, hostile uh, to black. And then it went on to even when Greg Childs said, there are zones that you are not supposed to be in. What
That's
did
right.
those men mean by that?
Well, I think in the case of Vincent Brown, who was an incredible historian, incredible, and Gregory Childs also. These are just some of the best historians working in their fields. But they are Vincent Brown is speaking to his own experience growing up in Southern California and in San Diego, and this almost like this community within a community, this Black community within a larger sort of like white community that had brought with them the stories from the South, where many of the families were from, and brought with them, the stories of, even of that we just that we experience day to day, and it's like that kind of the combination of the past and the present that kind of collaborate to create this feeling of uncertainty, of you're in the present, you're in 20th, you're in the 20th century, you're in a so-called a world that is not sort of like where race is not, um, where you would like to think that race is not the sort of like the defining feature of your reality, but um, but you have experiences that make you question that, right? And so you live with that uncertainty of what your status is, within this larger community, right? Are you welcome? Are you not welcome? Um, and Greg Childs, I mean, I love the way he puts it. I love that he kind of how he says, there are zones, you're not supposed to be in. You walked into the wrong one and you were lucky today, right? I think that's close to exactly what he says, and it's the luck part that actually that I hold on to, right? I mean, because I think we can all kind of wrap our heads around, like, there are places where, for whatever reason we may not be welcome, for all kinds of reasons, right? But it's like the fact that that your life might be the thing that you are um, putting at risk by
But is
making
there
that.
but are there areas in which you don't know that you just, you go somewhere and there's no idea that there would be any threat of any kind? Of course, it happened to you 7 years ago. You were at a Starbucks. You went to the gas station to fill up with gas. Why would there be any threat?
Right,
But then the threat appears out of nowhere for no reason because of one individual's ignorance.
right. Well,
You
it's
know,
almost like that it's the tragedy of it is that you're, your the rightness or wrongness of your presence can be defined by the intentions of a sole individual, right? and
Very much
um,
so.
and that's
But
sort of like that's the struggle that we're faced with, is that and that's the uncertainty and the vulnerability that we feel, is that we just we you're left to guess.
yeah. Now, I was appalled by what Gregory Child's teacher told him about his essay and told
Yeah,
him to rewrite it in front of her before she would believe him. I played that scene over a couple of times because I absolutely could not even fathom that. And to have
yeah,
somebody just show absolute blatant racism in the classroom, I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And that she judged him as if, what'd you do? Copy this out of a book? Not realizing that he is just like any other educated individual that can think for himself and reason and to read, literary works and come to conclusions on his own. She should be fired for that.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's one of the, as you know, one of the challenges of making any film is how much work and how much brilliance sort of like gets left on the cutting room floor. And there's Greg's so much of Greg's personal story, and the brilliance of his mother and his father, and how they raised him, and the how the deeply sort of like intellectual and literary home that he was brought up in, um, is one of the things that I was not able to fully include. And there are so many versions of the film on the way to where we landed, um, and yet, yeah, I mean, he was, is and was a brilliant student, and now a brilliant scholar, and with insights that are very nuanced and subtle, and and an intellect that is sort of so sort of like in touch with what may be going on the page, of literary page, or as he's sort of working through kind of archival documents in his own work, and that it's just a heartbreaking story. It just and it's and also, what I was not able to include was his journey back, his journey to be, back from, that experience. I mean, he says that, yes, he barely graduated high school, but, his, kind of going into college, ultimately, and rediscovering and recommitting himself, um, to, to the kind of work that he is, known for today is a real triumph. And it's yeah,
Yeah, I mean, because he had mentioned where he was this A student, he
mhm,
barely passed because of that one episode. Really, destroyed his identity, destroyed his self confidence. Teachers need to realize that words that come out of their mouth
yeah,
are either going to be building up the student or tearing down the student,
yeah,
but they need to focus on that their profession is teacher and that it's to nurture. And she should have
absolutely,
never walked into the situation with an accusation as strong as that one, and not realizing that she destroyed his inner being by what she said and what she made him do.
yeah,
And I when I went through elementary school and middle school and high school, there were those teachers that were great. I will always remember them. And there are those who should have never been given a teaching certificate in the first place.
sure,
And to see him go through that experience, but like you said, he came back, and he came back in a very big way.
yeah,
But I want to ask you something, because the two sisters, and
yeah,
they built this museum
yes,
for you when you first walked through the museum, what were your emotions and thoughts and feelings like?
It's funny. I mean, you know, I had sort of done my research online, and I had spoken to a reporter who covers that region in advance of going, and so I had a sense of something, but I had no really clue what I was about to encounter. It's kind of a magical place. They have I hope that in the film I kind of do some justice to it, but it is a walking, living experience. There are multiple pavilions and smaller houses that have been that are the site of a rich kind of collection of mementos and artifacts, that kind of document, right, the Black experience in that part of Canada. There's one, the main pavilion is a kind of a walking journey through, as you kind of encounter artifacts from different stages of the Black experience, kind of beginning from the middle path, going back to Africa, and through different stages of the Middle Passage. And it it's handmade, and they and I think many of the people who experience that museum, they experience it by being given a tour, by the sisters themselves, who kind of bring to it their own sort of stories and kind of individual, kind of unique sort of take on what things mean and how they were acquired. And it's a labor of love, and it's such an important um, institution, right, in Ontario.
But wasn't it their father's friend that died because of false accusation, and which in a way which destroyed him and
Mm.
was really, I guess, the catalyst in putting this living museum
Well,
together to show people?
yeah, it's well, unfortunately, it's their father. I mean, so Carolyn was I believe or four, and Sylvia, the younger sister, was just a few months old when their father was would died. Their father died in a very sort of suspicious circumstances, and they don't. I don't think they themselves use the word murder, but that he was the first Black foreman in this town, Collingwood, and a beloved figure, and married to um, um, you know, uh, a woman who was kind of descendant from one of the tentpole families in the Sheffield family in Collingwood, and he died on the job. Months before that, I was, he had been tarred. He was had tar thrown. I don't think I'd tell this story. I think this ultimately got cut from the film. But months before that, tar was thrown on him. It was just awful. He was sort of harassed, um, and um, and ultimately sort of fell from a ladder, kind of doing some tree work, and was run over by a truck. So it's an awful story, and it is absolutely a fueled their commitment to um, a lifelong commitment to telling the story of the diversity, of the Black history of that region, the diversity of the region, so that folk do not sort of grow up, children don't grow up, and reach adulthood thinking that there's just one kind of that the place that they live is just meant to be um,
To
for
bring
for
harm?
yeah, Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I can't, I literally cannot imagine. I mean, and I'm just being open and honest. And when I watch films like this one, I use it to learn. I use it to understand. And what the two sisters have created is something that I pray that most Canadians will spend time to go and see and learn and gain a whole new perspective of humanity.
Yeah.
And you have a short interview. Wesley Kidd loved it. Um, he said something so profound and will always hold true. And he tells that story when a neo-Nazi confronted him, and I guess he must be a bold individual because he said somebody didn't hug you and somebody didn't love you. But then he goes on to say, we have to love higher.
Harder,
And
harder, yeah, harder, yeah, yeah.
harder, harder, love
Mhm.
harder. And he's right. Because in the end, it only love conquers hate.
Well, yeah, and it's this. I kind of think about it from the standpoint of like going through this experience myself, and encountering people like Wesley Kidd. He goes by Bam,
Yeah.
also, and you know you are you have to sort of be of the mind at some point of like how you are going to kind of hold on to your own peace of mind, your own sense of who you are, to be, and not only to be sort of not to, certainly not to be sort of like um, um, you know overcome by these experiences, but how are you going to thrive? How are you going to sort of grow, and move forward boldly? And it is sort of like that feeling, those the feelings of love, and those positive feelings that absolutely have the ability of pushing you in the direction of kind of creating community, of strengthening bonds where you can. And he is it's funny, I made a film, I made a short film many years ago now, called Hug.
of
Which
all
was
of all titles, right?
exactly, and it went to Sundance back in, I guess it was a 2009 festival, years ago now. But he was speaking directly to me. I felt like when he told that story, because I just it's something that I believe deeply, right? That you have to like live and love hard. um, and sometimes that's all you kind of get. You don't get to sort of necessarily dictate the terms by which you are greeted or not
Yeah,
greeted, right?
yeah.
So, but you can, if you can, dictate how hard you're going to love, how hard you're going to live, and how how you, and a kind of a commitment to kind of like creating strong bonds where you can.
You've created this very strong, very powerful social impact film documentary. And you put yourself in this documentary, and there are these scenes of, how would we call it? I guess it is introspection in this film. There are these quiet moments. There's these looks on your face. There's that scene with what is it? Is it the red mask or something of
Yeah.
your face? And you mentioned this more than once in the film of being a corpse. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's funny. It's funny. There, look, I always say that this film was kind of born out of, and before there was a film, there were these attempts to sort of process, what had happened to me. And in that in that journey, which was a journey kind of, I would say, independent of whether or not there was ever going to be a film or what I was doing. I wasn't even telling my family, my friends, that I had this side art project where I would wake up in the middle of the night, or, when we were traveling somewhere, I would like steal away and with my camera and film these scenes. But over time, there were different versions of myself that emerged. There was and you mentioned the corpse, like there was this dead man. There was a man on fire. There's a woodsman. So there are these. If you remember from the film, there are these different scenes and different versions of myself that emerged. There was the bad man who was sort of like wanting to sort of seek retribution. But the dead man was the first portrait that I did. I did that back. I traveled back to the home where I lived most of my life as a kid. And I filmed myself, in this, as a body, as I as a kind of this version of myself that I don't think made it right.
They're
Out
very
of this, yeah,
the elements. Those elements in the film are very, very. I'm going to say very artsy, and I say that because there is a sense of power to them. This silent uh, power. There's a silent strength. There's a silent, I guess, maybe frustration.
mm,
Um, Not necessarily anger, because there's this feeling of searching and seeking within those shots.
mm.
And when I looked at them, I was like, those stills alone would make an incredible art installation at a gallery.
Yeah,
And so I love the way that you placed these elements in the film within the interviews with others, the storytelling. And
yeah,
again, and I can say this over and over again, everyone, regardless of color, creed, religion, or belief, needs to see this film, because it's the type of film that we need to have so we can start to learn to
yeah,
understand one another
yeah.
and hopefully remove judgment, because we need to stop doing that. Uh, for you, because in this film, how can society change the narrative of the black man and stop judging the physicality of a person by a narrative that's over 200 years old?
Well, that is the answer to that question is bigger than my film.
Yeah, I
um,
understand.
I think that um, it was important for me, and just to kind of like to pivot to back to what you were saying about the portraits. It was important to kind of answer your question. It was important to me to sort of include those elements because I was documenting ultimately a feeling, and there was nothing that I could say or do myself to communicate sort of what I was feeling, more so than kind of giving access to sort of like these things, that these portraits that I created in this very raw moment, this very raw time of my life. And so I think that I am every day, I'm it's sort of you when you hear about incidents of racial aggression or violence, and you just shake your head, because it's just so silly, you know. um and we're I think it's sort of like very pat and kind of like maybe trite to say, but we're all human beings.
We are all human
I mean,
beings, and
it's just sort of like, I don't know. I feel like I've created a film that is a very human, document. Is a very human. It kind of is my sort of like contribution to a history, to a history of a feeling, to a kind of aggression and kind of senselessness um, that we have and continue to live with. And I think that we all kind of have to sign up for um, a um, a kind of a much more sort of um, kind and open and interested, right, um, relationship with the people who we kind of encounter on the street, that we see, that we encounter on social media. We have to be sort of like interested, right, in their experience, and understand that they are that there's nothing that you have felt that they haven't felt, really. That your pain is not any deeper um, or more so than their pain or their fear. Except, I mean, it's like we are. It's part of the reason why we. I mean, I love STEM, but I think it's part of what maybe we're missing more and more of is are the kind of encounters with even in literature, like in poetry, right, the kind of encounters with people beyond our own experience that create that have the possibility of sort of like kind of taking those smolders of empathy and turning them into a kind of a roaring fire. So um, it's a challenge as a society that we have to that we're facing. But I think that it's not even a matter of do I think that we're up to it. I think that we have to be up to it.
We have to be up to it, but you're right. We need to stoke the embers of empathy more now than ever.
Yeah.
And when I watched your film, I thought back to what Rodney King had said. And it really put his statement in a much greater focus because of your film. Why can't we all just get along? Too many people made jokes about that. But there's nothing to laugh about that because those words are true. And you can't take away the truth of those words because with what you just said, it's going to take all of us, regardless of what color we are, to bring forth empathy, to bring forth respect, to stop judging one another because we don't know another person's story. And it comes down to the fact that nobody's listening and too many people are talking.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
rather sit and listen to one story and go, oh, now I understand because I'm the type of person that loves to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like that. It's that question. Why can't we all just get Um, and it starts with with each of us sort of like, right, being being in kind of like a seeking posture, right, and being kind of like an interested being, sort of like if not if you're not excited, being interested. um, and I think that's that posture. I think um, that I actually, when I would sit down in interviews with folk in the film, and when I sit across from anybody, it's one of the things I love about working in documentary, is that you if you lean forward and kind of give your attention to like that, to the person who you're sitting across from, you learn multitudes, right? And you um, and it kind of is it's a kind of it puts you in a position where you realize that you don't have all the answers. And maybe the people that you grew up with don't have all the answers. And maybe the point is sort of going out and being kind of open to the experiences of folk who um, you may not have even imagined, right? You know, had the kinds of stories that and the kind of experiences that they have had.
Yeah, I love what I do. I love the hundreds of people that I get to talk to every year because I
Hmm.
learn so much from all of them. Like I'm
Yeah.
learning more from you now, and as well as learning from watching your film. And then for you, how therapeutic was it to make Night Fight?
Hmm. Well, it's hard. It's so it's a hard question to answer because I'm a filmmaker, and so it's not like and if you're making an independent film of any kind, it's like it's very much a handmade kind of endeavor. And so, regardless of sort of how therapeutic, it was to at times to sort of to create these portraits, and then to sort of like to go out on the road and to conduct these interviews. Um, there's a kind of like, films don't make themselves.
That's
you
true.
know, and I mean they don't. And there was a time, I would say, well, there have been several times, but there was a time back in August where we were on vacation, just with my family, and I got COVID, and I was sent home, and I was at home with COVID, with a deadline, and and I was like, "Is this film ever going to get made?" You know, and you and in the end, that was like the best thing that happened to me, where was that week that I had to myself to kind of to pull myself up and rewatch a lot of these amazing interviews, to reconnect with the Wilson sisters and with Bam and Elizabeth Hinton and Vincent Brown and Kelly Carter Jackson. I can name them all: Carrie Greenidge, Kirsten Greenidge, Gregory Childs, Patrick Sylvain, like all these amazing people. They, you know, they give you a reason to pull through. They have something to say, and it was my job to kind of like get out of the way and at least make sure that anyone who was going to sit down and watch the film, um, was able to benefit from their brilliance and the uniqueness of their stories, the power of their stories. Um, yeah, it's that ultimately, yes, that there's a kind of a therapeutic nature in realizing that you're just kind of like a small part of, even though you're kind of like a vessel, right? To kind of make this film. You've got to kind of realize that you're just a small part of a larger message that needs
Well,
to
it
get
was
out.
your story that connected everybody else's stories
Sure. Yeah.
together, and which made this film very powerful. Now, what was the audience's reaction when it appeared at South by Southwest?
Well, that's the best part. One of the best parts of doing this film thing, being a filmmaker, is getting it out of your head, getting it on the screen, and then being able to share it, because you never know, right? What I remember, the first time I played it, Elizabeth Hinton made me show her a it was the final cut of the film, but it was like the unmixed, like uncolored, and I didn't even have my projector set up, and she was like, "No, just put it on. I'll watch it on the laptop." The laptop that I'm talking to you on right now, actually. And fortunately, I was terrified, and fortunately, that she was like I think the first person to sort of like watch like that, from the film, to watch that sort of that, like the final cut. And yeah, she loved it. I mean, it was just it in every and so the experience has been, of been very positive, of people sort of kind of, I think, sort of like taking a beat, after watching it, to sort of I think acknowledge and to kind of come back from sort of, it is a weighty film at times, but it is a film, I think, that people they realize, I think, how hard I worked, and I think it's evident in the film how hard I worked to kind of, I think you said it earlier, to kind of create kind of like a full and total, project, to not give a. I mean, the portraits are kind of fragments; they're kind of raw, but then I've worked so hard to bring my story out, to bring my family story out, to bring the stories of of all my contributors and collaborators on the film, and as a result, you do have a lot to connect with. You do have a lots of points of entry as you along the way. A lot of things that kind of keep you connected, and I think in the Q&As, I just loved kind of hearing from folk, because they kind of contributed their own stories, right, to the conversation.
I love that. I think that when films are at film festivals, it's the Q&A that really solidifies to the filmmaker what their work has done, the impact their work
Yeah.
is making. And this is one of those films that have a very strong impact. What do you hope audiences will take from your film when they see it?
I I honestly, I mean, I think that there are many audiences for the film. There are folk who they're like Black folk, people of color, who who live with this kind of vulnerability, and I hope that they're seeing something of their own experience in the film. And I hope that folk who have not experienced, you know, have not experiences like mine, or like others in the film, that they kind of sign up for that interested, leaning forward kind of like posture when it comes to being open to the humanity of people who they may have heard stories about but may have never met, right? And to be open to not to the stories that have been told about people, but to be open to the stories, to their own stories, right, of the folk to these kind of others, right, who they may um, who may they may see on TV, that who they may pass by on the street, um, who may live in their building, who may live down the street, to be interested in their actual story, their actual lives, the actual humanity of folk, and not to like the stories that have been told about them, because it gets very, we live in the world gets more dangerous when all of a sudden, when um, we are we're dependent on and invested in like these secondhand and third hand and fourth hand stories about people who we don't know. You know, the world is. I think that the world becomes a very dangerous place when these secondhand and third hand stories become the dominant narratives that mediate our connections with other people.
You're right, because the power should be in the people that are absolutely around us right now. Put our smartphones down, we sit down, we take time to listen firsthand of a person's story, because there's millions of these stories out there, and we all need to take time to listen to those
Yeah.
stories, because it allows that person to get it out. It
Mm.
allows the other person to receive it and to gain understanding. And as we both mentioned, to really stoke the fires of empathy even more, because that's the element that's going to create true change in humanity. And that's what we
Yeah.
need to see.
Yeah.
And ladies and gentlemen, Khary Jones drove alone down this quiet road of a Canadian resort town. The pre-dawn darkness folding in around him. See, the stillness shatters, the headlights appear in his rearview mirror, growing closer, tracking him with a quiet menace. Now, for 20 minutes, he is pursued by a vigilante. the night stretching longer than time itself, and 7 years later he returns. Not to seek revenge or even understanding, but to confront what remains of himself in the wake of that encounter. Night Fight is a film that should be seen by everyone, and we need to absorb the story and the history that Khary is trying to convey here. Now, racism is prevalent in every nation on earth, but is there a solution? Well, we have to work much harder. I should say, as Gregory Child said, we need to love harder and truly become a people who respect each other and stop judging by outward appearances alone. We should learn to study each other's history so we can gain insight and wisdom so we don't repeat it. And in the end, I think we need to focus even more, as Mr. Childs has said, love harder. We need to gain empathy in our society because this film, Night Fight, is a very powerful, compelling social impact film that, again, millions of people need to watch, absorb, and learn from, and then we can move forward with much greater understanding, empathy, and love. And Khary, I want to thank you so much for sharing your film and your story with me today.
Thank you. Very kind words. I appreciate our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Khary. And again, ladies and gentlemen, when you have the opportunity to see Night Fight, if you're at a film festival and it's there, make sure that you are sitting in the theater because this is the type of film that can, well, I'm just going to say it can truly bring us all together with greater love and understanding. So for all of you, I want to thank you for watching and listening. Please visit us at bondoncinema.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, check out our Prime show by the same name. And as for me, you're either going to see me at the movies or from the red carpet.